Hello, my name is Brian Adams. I'm one of the education coordinators at Assiniboine Park Zoo. And today, my portion of today's presentation will look at how the Assiniboine Park utilizes polar bears in its educational programming. To accomplish my goal, we will examine polar bears as icons and ambassadors, the messages we want people to receive at our zoo, the ways we communicate our messages, and the action steps we want people to leave with. And finally, we'll look at how we evaluate our successes in communicating our messages with our audience. The first step, though, is looking at polar bears as icons and ambassadors. So why polar bears? When people think of the North or the Arctic, often they're picturing cold and snow, maybe there's some ice. And then when they start to add the animals into the picture, they're going to start putting the polar bears. And there's an expectation for a northern zoo. People come in wanting to probably see those polar bears. And we want to highlight a local species and animals that people can see all year round and that can handle our wide range of climates. So the polar bear does make sense for a zoo in Canada. Now, our zoo is located in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and it's on the southern part of the province. At the northern part of the province, we have Churchill, Manitoba. And Churchill is nicknamed the polar bear capital of the world due to the amount of visible bears that people can find while they wait for the ice to freeze and begin their winter hunt. This polar bear population is also very heavily studied, and it's one of the most southern polar bear populations, so it's very accessible for people. Polar bears are also an emblem for Manitoba, and again, looking at this idea that this local species now, it's about 1,000 kilometers roughly between Winnipeg and Churchill. So I'm going to call them local because they're in our province. Polar bears also have a unique story with our zoo because our zoo developed the Manitoba Standard, which represents the high standards of animal cares. And this Manitoba Standard has also evolved as we learn more about animal care for the bears. And finally, we recognize that polar bears are in need. And so what's happened is that we see this really cute big animal, the charismatic megafauna. It's a keystone species for the tundra ecosystem. It's an apex predator, one of the heaviest land carnivores, but they rely on the ice. And if this animal is going to become a poster child, a strong association with climate change. And so now, as that climate's changing, we've recognized that these animals have a need, that they need help. And so this brings us into our messaging, that they can bring about a climate change awareness piece for us. So what happens is that those polar bears start to gather around the coast of Hudson Bay, waiting for that ice to freeze up so they can begin their hunt. But as the Arctic warms, that ice is taking longer to form. It starts to melt sooner. And so now we have orphaned cubs because some moms are saying they can't take care of their babies. Kids, you're on your own. Some moms love their children, they're taking care of their children, they're not taking care of themselves. And then we still have these orphan cubs. And our zoo wants to help these orphan cubs. We will let Mother Nature take care of Mother Nature. If that cub wanders into the town of Churchill, it can become a problem bear. And those are the bears that we can rescue and give a second chance at life. And before any bear comes to our zoo, we go through a conference to make sure that it's going to be a good ambassador for our zoo. But we also want to make sure that if any animal is coming to our zoo, that they have a job here at our zoo. And the role that they're going to play is to be that super cute animal, that charismatic megafauna. Because we want these people coming to our zoo to build a connection with these animals. And so the main message that we want to give people is this idea of building a climate change awareness of how the people can help these bears. There's other messages throughout our zoo, those standard zoo facts, the natural history, diet, range, and danger status. We look at animals' adaptations and behaviors. We do something really unique. We look at culture and conservation, how the indigenous people of Canada are connected to the land and the animals and the culture of the Arctic. So these little people components are hidden throughout our zoo signage as well, and that's really neat. And finally, the idea that if we're building this climate change awareness piece, we want to have action steps as well. And so once you become aware of the climate change situation, what are your next steps? And so when we created Journey to Churchill, we created it with 3 parts in mind. The first lower part of Journey to Churchill, we call the Wapusk Lowlands. And this place is where we want people to feel connected to the north, the northern animals, the plants of the north, the willows, the birches, the pines. And we created landscape views so you might be able to see multiple species at once. We're not trying to replace Churchill. We want people to have such a great time at our zoo that they say, do you know what, this was so amazing. Let's go to Churchill and learn more. So really we're trying to build is this connection here to make them feel like they're immersed in the a northern setting. And once they build this connection to our northern species, they will enter the gateway to the Arctic building. And this is an opportunity where people might see polar bears and seals swim in the water. But the main purpose of this building is for people to build this awareness piece of climate change. There's a great 360 theater in there, which does a wonderful job of presenting that message. But this is our opportunity where people can now build this awareness piece. And once they're aware and connected to it, as they move out of Gateway to the Arctic and into the coast of Churchill there, that's the place where we can start to develop the action steps for people. But we understand that people are not going to take action unless they are connected to the issue. So building this connection is so very important in Journey to Churchill. And so we have a couple of ways to communicate our messaging to our audiences. And our audiences in the education setting are going to come in a couple different ways. One direction is the self-directed. So people are just going to come to the zoo on their own, maybe bring their family. Maybe it is a school group that hasn't booked an educational program. How are they going to get our messaging? So the first part is that, yes, we have lots of signage throughout it. And our signage, again, goes on for the natural history of the animals, climate change, animal care, the tundra and Arctic ecology. But we also have videos and interactive games and touchable signs. And we've also created programming for these teachers that might not have a program. So we have a teacher-led program where they can download the materials that they need to explore our zoo and feel like they can confidently talk about the subject matter. We also have a neat program called Schools in Residence. And this is a funded program where we can bring a classroom into our zoo for about a week. And they can do their school materials in one of our zoo classrooms, but they can also take advantage of the educators and maybe do a program throughout the week, and hoping that when they come to the zoo for a week and spend their time immersed in the zoo setting, that they can actually create a sustainability project that teaches others to learn about conservation and climate change. One of those self-directed activities that the students might be doing are ethogram behaviors. So here's an example of how we might teach students to look for polar bear communication methods. And maybe you can identify them yourself. If you're trying to find the aggressive bear, which bear looks aggressive? Well, hopefully you want to avoid a bear like that. Maybe you're looking for the defensive bear. And again, probably your head down, ears back, listening to sounds around it. Or the curious bear, head up. And this is a great thing that they can do looking at our bears on display. We also have some videos of polar bears and their first introductions to each other. And that's a great way that they can practice their ethogram and behavior observation skills. The other way that we will communicate with groups is through tours. And we get a couple different types of tours. There are the public and school groups. And these tours are great. Often the public tours are offered during special events. Group tours are booked. We also have tour operators that provide eco tours. So these are the people that will do a tour up in Churchill, Manitoba, and they might come to our zoo either before or after their Churchill experience, just to, again, learn more about bears or to see the bears. And during these tours, we can often create a high-end tour experience. And this will often look at the roles of a modern zoo and how a zoo plays an important role in today's society. Again, making sure that a modern zoo focuses on conservation, education, research, and the highest standards of animal care. And often these high-end tour experiences involve an interaction with our conservation and research department. so that they can talk about the current studies that they're doing with our animals at the zoo, or maybe the studies that are happening out in the field. So that's really neat interaction for people to get to see how the role of a zoo is important in today's society. We've also created the Canadian Signature Experience Tour, again, fairly similar to our high-end tours. The Canadian Signature Experiences were developed through the tourism industry, and they were tours across Canada that were the highest quality of tours, but focusing on really great Canadian experiences. So we're very happy to develop that one. The other type of tour that we do offer are behind the scenes. And so we do offer an opportunity for people to go behind the scenes of our polar bear as well as our seals. And these tours are often very focused on the high standards of animal care we provide, and looking at the positive reinforcement training that we do with our animals, looks at animal enrichment, and again, those high standards of animal care. And throughout all of our tours, we're often discussing the natural behaviors we see, providing the fun facts, but we also love to look at the personal stories of our animals, because we understand that you can get the facts from a book or computer. It's those personal stories about these animals. And when we look at our polar bears, animals that have been rescued from the north, what is that bear's story? Why was it in trouble? How can we help it? And again, building these connections with our animals. I'm going to give you a moment to take a screenshot here or to pull out your phone. And I want you to take a picture of that link at the bottom there. That is one of our virtual tours that we also provide to people. The link will be active for the month of December. And if you want to get a virtual tour of Journey to Churchill and our zoo, that's one of our links you can follow. It's about 15 minutes you can do on your own time. Another virtual experience that we could offer is that recently we've done a pairing with a media company, and we produced a show called Arctic Vets. I'm not sure about its accessibility in Japan, but there is an app called CBC Gem, great way where you can learn about animal care, and they utilized our zoo as the setting for that show, which I think is a really neat way to learn about polar bears and as well as what happens in the zoo. And my favorite way of communicating with the audience is through the programs. And this is really the educational side of things, where we bring in their school groups. And when the school's coming to our zoo, again, they're looking for that knowledge piece. They want to learn about an animal's adaptations or behaviors or the ecology of the Arctic. And so we offer a variety of polar bear programs at our zoo. Our biggest program here is called Polar Bears. Just a nice, simple title, allows people to know what they're getting. And this is our program where we talk about how the polar bear is an important part to the Arctic ecosystem and how it interacts with the other animals throughout our zoo. And sometimes it's also when you have a younger age, you might just be comparing that polar bear to a snowy owl. How are they alike? How are they different? But the main part of our programs is to build a conservation awareness. And so, yes, we will talk about climate change and we'll look at the action steps, but we want people to connect to nature. And if you have a 90-minute program, that can be a little challenging. But when you get up close to these animals, it can be really exciting experience for people to have. And if we're not creating a nature connection, at least we should be doing is creating an improvement towards nature and attitude adjustment towards nature. So realize that nature is great, and improving those nature attitudes, a positive attitude and encouragement that way. So throughout our programs, we would like to be hands-on. This is probably a Western educational focus of self-inquiry, using different methods of learning. So one of the things we might do is talk about camouflage, or maybe we're talking about Arctic research and the things that are happening at the Leatherdale International Polar Bear Conservation Center, where researchers are interacting with our studying our polar bears as well as studying animals out in the field. And so if they're doing an aerial survey, we might ask our students, can you find the polar bear in this picture? And this is really unique because you're picturing yourself up in a plane flying over the Arctic, and your job is to count the polar bears, and you're searching and you're searching, and this is really hard trying to find that bear. I'm going to add my little red circle here for those who haven't found it yet. There's Waldo. Yeah, so other interactions, we could be doing a blubber glove, having kids put their hand in a glove filled with fat so that they can feel what the insulation of blubber would feel like. Or maybe having students dress up as an imaginary Arctic animal by using junk to explain an adaptation. So they're adding blankets over themselves and trying to say why this animal has these layers and why is that important? Or maybe what are the importance of claws in the Arctic? And we also want to do team building and problem solving games. And so we have a game where people have to figure out how to get from one side of the room to the other side of the room using pieces of newspaper as pretend ice. Because when we start talking about the action steps, it's important that we learn that we also need to work together. And it's important to create these ways to solve problems. Role-playing games, learning how to hunt like a polar bear or talk like a polar bear. Lots of ways. We just want to try so many ways to interact with our audience, to give them different ways to learn. And we do have a wide variety of audience members coming to our programs. So we will interact with the public, schools and daycares. We will activate people virtually. This came in very popular with COVID. So going on a computer and being able to bring out a polar bear skull and talk about the adaptations through a variety of biofacts is lots of fun. Now we can go back out to schools and do outreach programs, having workshops for toddlers, and again, just encouraging this love of nature, working with youth groups like Girl Guides or Boy Scouts, homeschooling groups, and even sleepovers, all variety of ways where we can interact with people and trying to share the messages of why these bears are in trouble and how we can help them. Which brings us into the action steps. And the first way that I want to seek answers, create these action steps, is to see what people are already doing. Because often when people are coming to the zoo, they have a love of nature already, and they already have things that they are doing, like composting and recycling. And I want to hear those answers because it shows other people what they're doing, and maybe they haven't started not using plastic straws and using metal straws instead. So trying to find those answers there. And maybe they're talking about the R's of sustainability, the reduce, reuse, recycle, learning about new R's like regifting or repairing, renew if you cut down a tree, planting a new one, rethinking. And the youth today are much more intelligent than I am with new inventions, and those new ideas are going to be important as well. But the biggest action step that I want people to leave away with is to celebrate this connection to nature. And we really looked at the International Union Conservation of Nature, the IUCN's 2011 campaign, Love Not Loss, and this idea that we need to share our love of nature, this idea that we had such a great time at the zoo, or I saw a polar bear swim above my head and that was so amazing. Or even if they're just sharing their own personal stories. They went camping, they spent a night under the stars, and they felt so at peace. When we share our love of nature with our friends or our families, other people are going to say, hey, that sounds really cool. I want that. And if they're saying, I want that, then they're also going to need to start taking action to protect nature. So really, we like this idea of encouraging time outside. Go spend some time in nature and then share that love, share your stories, because that's one of those ways that we're going to start telling people that nature is important and it needs to be protected. Yes, and so then hopefully taking action. And this is a little bit harder for us to understand how much action happens outside the program once people have left the zoo. We did have a university student from the University of Manitoba who explored the role of post-visit action resources and how they could contribute to removing barriers to sustainable action practices. And so her research, she interviewed people at the zoo, and then when they left, she stayed in contact with them. And her study showed that if visitors receive follow-up information about sustainable behaviors after their visit, there is an increase in their sustainability actions. For example, out of the 362 zoo visitors that went through the Leatherdale International Polar Bear Conservation Center, half of them received follow-up information on sustainable behaviors, the other half didn't. Unsurprisingly, more people from the group that received the follow-up information felt that they had increased their sustainable behaviors since their zoo visit. I think it was about a 40% to a 14% difference. But if we know that zoo visitors who receive these positive reinforcements after their visit, then they're more inclined to increase their sustainable behaviors. And if we know that accredited zoos attract over 180 million visitors a year, then there's a possibility of a 40% increase of sustainable climate change behavior. That could be a lot of people, 7 million people. We could increase them. So it shows the importance of staying in contact with people after their visit and showing them how we can extend learning beyond the on-site so they can contribute positive changes. So this has been one of our difficulties, though, is how do we evaluate success? I've got people coming into the zoo. I've captured their imaginations with polar bears. It's been great. I'll send an online evaluation after that program. And I don't get a lot of feedback on that evaluation. We've tried other methods of going into classrooms before and after their experiences, and this has been really neat where we do mind maps, having this classroom tell us what they knew about polar bears before their visit, and then returning a couple weeks later and creating another mind map of what they've learned after that visit. And then we have this sort of qualitative data to show how well this program improved. We are now looking at a new method to evaluating our successes. And we're going to try what we're calling impact questions. And so at the end of every program, we're going to ask those students, did you learn something new about polar bears today? And I'm hoping we'll see some hands. And this is going to measure how much knowledge they're gaining from our programs. The second question I'm going to ask them is, did you have a moment today that made you appreciate nature? Or maybe you had that wow moment, like, this is so cool. And again, hoping to see those hands up, and this is going to measure our connectedness. How many people did we actually reach, build a connection with nature, or at least improve that attitude? And then the last impact question we're going to ask at the end of every program is, did you hear a new way to help nature today? The idea behind this question is, what is that sustainability piece that they're taking away? So did they hear something new to them? Because if they're already recycling, that's not new to them. But I'm hoping that this idea of sharing the love of nature, that's going to be a new idea for them. And if we're not getting new ways, that's going to tell us that we need to find new ways to give them new solutions and new answers so that they can bring those home. So those are going to be our next system of evaluating success here at our zoo. And I'm looking forward to practicing that in the new year. So it's been a whirlwind tour of sharing with you educational programming here at Assiniboine Park Zoo. And I do believe you have some ways of following up through email communications. And I wish you all the best with your polar bears at your zoo. So thank you.
Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Stefan Peterson. I'm the Director of Conservation and Research for Assiniboine Park Zoo in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. I'm also the chair of the Leatherdale International Polar Bear Conservation Center. So today, to fit in with the symposium theme, I want to talk about polar bears in Canada and the threats they face, but really spend a bit more time focusing on what's going on in Manitoba, and also how our work at the zoo is hoping to assist with polar bear conservation in the province and within Canada at large. So I like to start most of my talks off with a bit of an orientation to where we are in the world. So here is a map looking down on the North Pole, showing the approximate range of polar bears and where Manitoba is situated. We have quite a bit of interactions with polar bears as they go throughout their annual cycle. So it's pretty chilly here in Manitoba right now. We're in the winter. The bears have moved back onto the ice. They're trying to find seals and hunt seals and gain weight. They're really going to be probably losing weight until we get into the spring, and there's lots more ring seal pups that they can get out and hunt and eat. In the spring is also the time when males and females are trying to find each other on this big expanse of ice in order to mate. Then for Hudson's Bay, at least, all of that ice will melt. And it does this every year. It's a natural part of the process. But when it does melt, those bears that were out on the ice for the entire time are forced back on shore. And so during the summer, they're pretty much hanging out. They're conserving energy, but they're also really curious, and they'll investigate new smells or human smells, and that can lead to difficult situations and instances of human-bear conflict. And then into the autumn, they've been fasting for a number of months. The bears that aren't female bears that are pregnant will be out on the ice, but those female pregnant bears will be in dens, and they'll spend their entire winter pretty much in those dens, and that'll bring us back to spring. And so the primary threat to polar bears is really related to habitat change as a result of global warming. So as the climate changes, we have these predictions, and not all subpopulations of polar bears are in the same state right now, but this trajectory to warmer air temperatures, warmer sea temperatures, and reductions in the amount of sea ice is pretty consistent, just the timing is different. So this is an infographic looking at into the future which subpopulations will be experiencing or could be experiencing reproductive failure based on the climate models. And so you can notice that the southern Hudson's Bay and western Hudson's Bay, where we are furthest south, or one of the furthest south subpopulations. And this means that they go into danger zones a lot sooner than the rest of the subpopulations. So as I mentioned, the biggest threat to polar bears is climate change. And these high impact, low impact are actually from threat assessments that Canada did for polar bears in 2019 in order to determine the status of polar bears in Canada. And so the highest impact, the high impact threat was associated with climate change, and primarily habitat shifts in habitat and altered habitats. But the report also indicated that there are some other low-level impacts, one of those being biological resource use. So this includes harvest, but it also includes human-bear conflict, and pollution was another one. So the human-bear conflict is one that's pretty interesting. It's relevant for this symposium, but it's also one that arguably we have a lot of control over. And so communities and folks in those landscapes can take ownership and work to minimize the number of polar bears that might be killed due to human-bear conflict. In Manitoba, we have a bit of a split in how we conserve polar bears. So in the north, We have a lot of resources that are expended by the province and by municipalities in order to manage those polar bears. And then in the south, we have more focus on how do we institute some climate change action? How can we be changing our lifestyles and encouraging others to do so in ways that will reduce our CO2 output and hopefully keep polar bears in Manitoba far into the future. So I'm going to just chat a bit more about Churchill. Churchill is where is situated in that northern part of the province along the coast of Hudson's Bay. And every year, polar bears move through the Churchill area on their way to head north to meet the ice or just to hang out on the coast. And this has made it necessary that over the years, a system for dealing with bears be created. And so this has taken the form of the Polar Bear Alert Program that's run by the province of Manitoba. And they have a number of highly trained conservation officers that work to keep bears and people safe. And so they have a bit of a graded approach to the actions that they take. So around the town of Churchill, number one, very high priority area, and they work really hard to keep bears out of that area or move bears through that area because that's the highest risk of negative interactions with people. And then out from there, there's less management action that takes place. And although the Polar Bear Alert Program is in place, the town of Churchill actually does a really great job and has developed a system to try and minimize the number of negative polar bear interactions. So they have pretty unique waste disposal strategies. So garbage is kept in bear-proof containers, and then when it's moved to the dump, that's all enclosed and bears can't access it. And then eventually it'll get shipped out or it'll get buried in a deep burial so that, again, bears can't access it. And this is all because we know from the past and from other locations that bears, once they've gotten a food reward from some of these things, they're quite persistent at coming back and trying to get into those buildings, and then that can lead to conflict. So along with these waste disposal strategies, there's also local education programs for residents of Churchill to understand and work in a landscape that has polar bears. Most of the folks that are long-term residents, of course, know all these things, but as new people move into the community, others will help educate them. And then there's also visitor education programs. So there's a lot of tourists that come in and they need education as well, and in order to be safe on that landscape. In recent years, we've seen more bear safe training for guides and bear guards for hire as well. So when I think about my work, when we go up, we can hire someone to be our bear guard while we're doing research, and other researchers that are working in that landscape are also encouraged to do the same. And this is an added piece of security, so you can do your work, but someone's looking out and can scare bears away or get you out of situations before they can become dangerous for the bears or for the people. And so I mentioned the Polar Bear Alert Program. This is a long-standing program that will move bears out and to safety or put them in the handling facilities. and eventually either release them or relocate them in order to keep people safe. One of the interesting things over in recent years is we've seen an increasing tourism demand. And this comes in a number of different forms. So there's a few larger operators that have tundra vehicles or vehicles that go out onto the tundra. And this is quite well regulated. There's a number of smaller operators that guide small groups. They tend to stick around Churchill to the roads and to the trails and don't go out on the tundra. As I mentioned previously, a lot of those folks are able to take advantage of training programs, and they have regulations under their permits that keep them and their guests and the bears safe. And we're seeing more self-guided options, and these are probably the highest potential to have a negative bear human interaction. And so it's one that I know lots of folks are quite interested in. How do we maybe guide people to these other options at the best case scenario, but then maybe provide them with the information they need to be safe if they're not going to go with a guide. And all these things are really to try and keep bears as safe as possible and as people as safe as possible. So that's the number one priority for folks. And there's other people and organizations that are also working in Churchill. And so at Assiniboine Park Zoo, we have a pretty unique situation where we have skills and facilities that are set up in ways that I think we can really help understand polar bear behavior and develop new ways of doing research that will help keep bears and people safe in a number of different ways. So some of the work that we just published looked at using thermal imagery to understand the temperature changes in polar bears, to understand how much energy they're using during the sparring or the play behavior that we see in the fall, quite commonly in Churchill, but also at our facility. And this was a test of the usefulness of using thermal imagery on polar bears. In the far past, you sometimes hear that, polar bears are so well insulated that they don't show up on thermal imagery, but that's not actually the case. They do radiate heat, and that means we can use this methodology both to understand polar bear energetics, but it's also a technology that could be used to detect polar bears and keep bears deterred away from where their people are all day long, so during the night as well. We've also partnered with colleagues at Polar Bears International and a number of bears throughout, or organizations throughout North America that have polar bears have also assisted. And so they've developed a number of tag designs that don't rely on a collar design or an ear tag sort of thing. So these potentially could be deployed in a much less invasive way. But we've worked with our bears and taken advantage of when they've been anesthetized for other medical reasons in order to test out some of these tag designs. And this provides some pretty valuable information that we can't get from wild bears on the ways that these designs fail so that they can be redesigned and work better in the wild. And in Churchill in the past, they've used similar sorts of tags just deployed on their ears to detect or to have an early warning system for bears that are problem bears that repeatedly come back into the communities. So that's a way to get an early detection and reduce conflict on bears that are repeat offenders, as it were. One of the larger projects that we've had is looking at where polar bear denning is in Canada, and to create a map that then can be used by other organizations and jurisdictions in order to understand where important polar bear habitat is. And so the advantage of using this is that it provides a way that communities can take their local knowledge and add it to this map and decide what to do on that landscape that will minimize the impact on polar bears. So if they have, industrial development that wants to take place, or they want to take place around a community, they might be able to say, using this map and the local knowledge that, we want to stay out of this area at this time of the year, or maybe we want to shift activities to a different location. Not directly related to conflict, but one of the things that we've expanded on is looking at where in the southern areas, so in Hudson's Bay, is there an overlap between increasing fire risk because the peatlands are drying out or the forests are growing up and then getting dry? Where does that overlap with polar bear denning? And where can we provide some advice on where wildfires should be controlled or not in order to preserve polar bear denning habitat and keep these populations healthy? So there's a number of ways that all sorts of stakeholders in Manitoba are collaborating together in order to keep polar bears and people safe. So most of this is really focused in Churchill, and the town of Churchill and the province work really hard, and all the residents really work hard to keep polar bears present and safe and everything working smoothly. But there's also a role, I think, for facilities such as ourselves to contribute and support their efforts and support and understand and test out new ways of doing things. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and wish you all a really great rest of your day. Thank you very much.